Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is day 290, 290, Friday, Fun Friday. We always like to have fun on a Friday. Hey, and could there be anything more fun than learning that the attorneys for Alexei Gubarev now know who gave BuzzFeed the dossier? That sounds like a lot of fun, doesn't it? I think so. But before I get on to that, I just want to say thank you to quite a few people who've left in the comments section on my previous video the fact that I've now eclipsed 500 subscribers. So thank you very much, everybody, for all your comments there, positive comments. And it's kind of funny, you know, when I started doing these videos 290 days ago, you know, on that day when Trump tweeted out that he had just learned that Obama had wiretapped him, I just had a feeling that this was going to be a huge story and that there would be a lot more to come. And so I decided to do a diary, a daily diary. First, I was going to just write things down in a spiral notepad, but I eventually thought, well, I'll just do a daily video. So these TowerGate videos are simply a daily diary. So I am happy to be sharing my personal diary with 500 people, and God knows how many more will join along for the ride, because what we're doing here, and I didn't realize it when I started out thinking I was just doing a day-by-day diary of following the events of Trump being wiretapped and where that might lead. I had no idea it would lead us into a deep state coup. And so now we're watching and monitoring and cataloging the events that are taking place day by day as we move through this process to expose the deep state coup. That's why we're all here, and I appreciate you all being here with me. This is a historical moment. It's hard to know when you're living through these events exactly what it is that you're living through. But I believe that when we get to the end of this road, and it's not too much farther down the road, we are going to realize that we experienced history, and I have cataloged it from day one. Thank you so very much. I also wanted to comment to another one of my subscribers who left a link for another YouTuber who I am a subscriber to his channel. He is a subscriber here to my channel. Son of Nuo, fantastic YouTuber, great researcher, and he's recently done a video where he asked some very, very interesting questions about Peter Ben Strokinus and what his identity, if I can say it, his identity. Now, there's so much to cover today that I cannot get to it, but I will be getting to this theory that Son of Nuo has put out on his most recent video. It's fascinating. So we'll be getting into that, but today is just so busy, I don't even know I'll get through today's news, and it's big news. And there are breaking stories as I was doing the research for this video. News stories, 2 new things are breaking as I was doing the research. So there's a lot of things happening right now. Big things. So let's go ahead and get to it. So as I was telling you, it appears that the attorneys for Alexei Gubarev, and remember, Alexei Gubarev is the man who is suing Christopher Steele in that civil suit in the UK and suing BuzzFeed in Florida in a civil suit because he was named in that final memo of the dossier as the person whose tech company did the physical hacking of the DNC, which he strongly denies. And based on that, he's got these civil court cases looking for damages and to clear his name. So let's follow the latest events in the last few days that have happened, because there's been some serious movement in that civil case down in Florida. So here we go. Mr. Gubarev's attorney is a man named Mr. Gurvitz. Mr. Gurvitz. Val Gurvitz is the attorney for Alexei Gubarev. Val Gurvitz. He is a Russian attorney. He says the BuzzFeed source has finally been identified. Mr. Gurvitz made the statement to a judge when he was responding to a verdict. So what happened is they're in court and they're there to hear the judge's verdict on a previous motion, which was that Mr. Gurvitz wanted BuzzFeed to have to tell them who provided them with the dossier. But the judge, as it turns out, ruled in favor of BuzzFeed and said no, BuzzFeed is claiming reporters' privilege to keep their sources secret and not to have to reveal their identity, and the judge ruled in favor of BuzzFeed. But as the judge made the ruling, the attorney for Mr. Gubarev, Mr. Gurvitz, just looked back at the judge and said, well, that's okay, Your Honor, because we want to withdraw the motion. It is no longer necessary because in a previous court hearing, Mr. Gubarev had filed a motion because David Kramer and a couple other people had been avoiding their court order for a deposition. So Mr. Gubarev's attorneys, Mr. Gurvitz, goes and files this motion with the courts, and that eventually forces these last couple of people to come in for depositions. One of them, David Kramer. And as a result of those depositions, the attorney for Mr. Gubarev, Val Gurvitz, has now determined who was the person that leaked the dossier to BuzzFeed. So he no longer cares. He no longer cares that BuzzFeed won in that particular issue, that they can keep the source private, because, like I said, in a previous ruling, he was given permission to do these depositions. That had been battled over for 3 or 4 months. So finally they said, yes, Mr. Gubarev, your attorneys and the attorneys for these other people that they wanted to depose, including Kramer and Christopher Steele, had to sit for depositions. So they completed those depositions, and now that they've done that, they have figured it out. They know who gave the dossier to BuzzFeed. Now we know that David Kramer also just showed up, and he was deposed by the Congress, the House Intel Committee, just this past week. So now Mr. Gurvitz has figured it out. He knows who gave BuzzFeed the dossier, which they published on January the 10th, 2017. Mr. Gurvitz wanted the testimony of that person as to the veracity of the dossier. If the person who leaked this to BuzzFeed said it was unverified, shaky, or false, Mr. Gurvitz could then make the case proving negligence. Mr. Gurvitz states that he cannot reveal as of yet who the source is because there is a gag order on the case. But it looks a lot like the person that gave the dossier to BuzzFeed was David Kramer, head of the Magoo Institute, the right-hand man of Senator Magoo, one of 3 chairmen of the Halifax International Supervisory Council, speaks fluent Russian, a Russian expert, and maybe a ham radio operator, possibly even an intermediary. But we know one thing, it's about 95% certain now, based on this story from Chuck Ross at the Daily Caller, who's been following the dossier as close as anybody. And that's what he is saying, that everything is pointing to, based on the timing. They finally get their deposition with David Kramer. Shortly thereafter, they go to this court hearing. The judge says, I'm ruling in favor of BuzzFeed. They don't have to reveal the source. Gubarev's attorney goes, I don't care. I already know the source. We figured it out. While we were waiting for you people to come up with a decision, we figured it out. Because the previous court ruling gave us the ability to depose the people we had been wanting to talk to, and based on those depositions, we figured it out. Looks like it was David Kramer. Like I say, if it walks like a duck, if it looks like a duck, if it barks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Very, very interesting. Just what we suspected. And I have also suspected for several months now that when I learned that David Kramer was one of the 3 board heads for this Halifax International Forum, where Senator Magoo claims he first heard about the dossier from Sir Andrew Wood, or in a discussion that was being had. And we've also learned that it was all over the Halifax International Forum, that there was a chatter and a buzz all around about this dossier. And I've become more in the last few months to believe that McCain, Senator Magoo, was essentially set up and used. Because this was exactly at the time, if you remember, Christopher Steele had been feeding information to the FBI and anyone else he could feed it to. We know he met with the FBI in Rome, Italy in July and also in September. But then, once I believe it was the New York Times outed him and his name came out, the FBI dropped him like a hot potato. We also know that back in the States, Glenn Simpson of Fusion GPS was doing everything he could to pump the story out to every media outlet he could find. And we know that they were trying their very damnedest, working with all their people, all working together, working with their international sources to verify any part of it, but they never could. They were desperate to get the dossier out there. We know that Christopher Steele, through other sources, was feeding it to the CIA, and they were feeding it again in a loop back to the FBI. So every effort in the world was being made to get this dossier out there. And Steele and Glenn Simpson were getting desperate because they knew that if they didn't get this out, that they wouldn't achieve their goal of stopping Trump from becoming president. They wanted this out there. They wanted it out there badly. It's looking more and more like David Kramer was being the guy there at Halifax International, knowing good and well he's the right-hand man of Senator Magoo, who is very close to Brennan and who is also on the Senate Intelligence Committee. We also know that he learned about some of the memos from the dossier because they were also shared with Harry Reid, who also shared them with Senator Magoo. And he also wrote a letter to the FBI, 2 letters, asking them to investigate. So we know that they were feeding this thing in every possible direction from Fusion GPS and Christopher Steele. We know that Christopher Steele says he was asked by Glenn Simpson at that point to come to the U.S. and talk to these reporters at the Washington Post, the New York Times, Yahoo News, The Guardian, to give them some confidence that they needed to start publishing some of the information in the dossier. So we can see that they had reached a point of desperation to get this out. And that's why they finally found BuzzFeed, the sucker who had put this thing out. And now BuzzFeed is finding out why no one else would do it. Because they're going to lose that lawsuit. Christopher Steele is going to lose, and so is BuzzFeed. Especially now because they know who gave that dossier to BuzzFeed. And now the next thing that they're going to do, Mr. Gubarev's attorney, Val Gurvitz, the next thing he's going to do now is he is going to get a court order to do a deposition of this person they've now interviewed, unless it's David Kramer, who he has already given a deposition to, in which case he'll be called into the court hearing and he will have to give witness to what he knows. And at this point, that is where that individual, if it is David Kramer, will have to tell exactly how much confidence he had in the information, whether or not it was true, false, or what have you. And that's what they're going to use to try to win their case. So that is the latest on the issue going on with the civil court case down in Florida, but it's taken an amazing turn. So we don't have 100%. The attorney cannot come out and tell us it's David Kramer, but everything points to David Kramer. And of course, we did his bio here about a month ago. And when we went through his bio, I said there's a very good chance that David Kramer could certainly be the man. We know there's only 5 people that had access to the full 35-page dossier, including the last memo that was put in, which turned it from a National Enquirer sex story into a real piece of, like an intelligence document. And that's when Mr. Gubarev's name was put in as well. So there we go. Do you think that David Kramer and Nellie Orr, that their paths may have crossed? Think about it. They both speak fluent Russian. They're both Russian experts. They both hang around all these Russian think tanks. Their careers are very similar. They're in a certain community. They're both Russian speakers. Be very interesting to know, with Mr. David Kramer's association with these various groups, including the Central Intelligence Agency. In previous administrations, he was in the Bush administration, the W. Bush administration. So it's very likely that these two paths may have crossed, and you have to wonder about that question. I'm certain someone will ask that at some point. The Supreme Court reporter Kevin Daly is now reporting that the Gorsuch nomination paid off because we just won a 5-4 ruling. 5-4 ruling with Gorsuch delivering that fifth vote, shooting down the latest barrage from the lower courts. This latest one was in California, demanding that all documents relating to the decision of the Trump administration to terminate the DACA program, that's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Of course, the plan that's being run here by all these lower courts filing all these lawsuits and all these things is simply part of the plot that's being run by Obama out of his home there in D.C., just about a mile, 2 miles from the White House, where he has a operation set up, being run, headed up by Valerie Jarrett and others, lawyers, who we learned right after the election their plan was just to file lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit on every single thing to try to gum up the works. This is a classic Saul Alinsky tactic, right out of the playbook of Saul Alinsky. And that's what's going on there. And the Supreme Court is getting fed up. That is it, because they didn't just make the ruling, but the term used by Mr. Daly is that the two of the justices chided these lower courts. In other words, took them to task. They're getting sick and tired. The Supreme Court's getting sick and tired of seeing these lower court rulings that are ridiculous and are a joke. And they're starting to let these lower courts know that they're getting fed up with them. And they should. Well, the New York Times is running a headline saying Trump is about to stage a coup. They still think he's going to fire Mueller. No, he's not going to fire Mueller. I would say that's about a 99.9% chance he will not fire Mueller. Why should he? Mueller is destroying himself. I'd let him keep going. At the rate he's going, we've had more exposure about the dossier and about the deep state coup since he started than before. Hell, keep going, Uncle Bob, the executioner. You're committing suicide and taking all your friends down with you. Godspeed, Mr. Mueller. Continue. Ben Rhodes, another one of the yes man for Obama, who was the Deputy Secretary of Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, just sent out a tweet to one of his friends making a joke about Pence, McConnell, and Ryan's death. Of course, that got a fiery response from Steve Scalise. You remember Steve Scalise? He's the Republican who got shot by the sniper at the baseball game in Virginia back in the spring. The Democratic National Committee will close out 2017 with millions of dollars of debt. Obama and the Rotten Reverend. Obama pocketed millions, and the Rotten Reverend came along to pick the bones clean. The Democratic National Committee's lowest funding in more than 10 years. They can't raise any money. You wonder why, huh? The GOP, on the other hand, on the strength of Trump, have $39 million on hand and zero debt. Let's see. The DNC is broke and has millions of dollars of debt, and the GOP has $39 million on hand and zero debt. That makes sense. Well, the colostomy bag-toting Rotten Reverend in her Chairman Mao poop-stained pantsuit made off with the loot. And then she tried to use her minions to frame Trump. But it's not going to work, Reverend. In fact, the Rotten Reverend is probably tuning in to the broadcast right now. It's not going to work, Reverend. You're going to jail. You're going to get, maybe they'll give you a good government-issued colostomy bag that doesn't leak. Rand Paul is the latest senator to call for an investigation into what he says was collusion with the Obama administration to prevent the election of Donald Trump. He says it's worse than Watergate. Where have you heard that? I figured that out 290 videos ago. I mentioned to you several times in several videos that during the Watergate fiasco, that scandal, which I studied meticulously and understand very well and have laid out in previous videos, along that way to get to where it eventually ended up, 2 years and 8 months, 2 years and 2 years and 10 months. 2 years and 10 months for the entire scandal to finally, from beginning to end. I followed it very closely, and as I said, there were many flash points along the way. About a week ago, when the Peter Benstrokinus texts came out about the insurance policy, I said this is a major flash point. And what happens every time you get a flash point, it rocks the foundation of the whole situation. And those people who are sitting back, who could be vulnerable to criminal prosecution, get very nervous. Also, when people see weakness, they feel like if they have an opportunity, if they've been stopped in the past, like a lot of these whistleblowers, that now is their opportunity to leap, that they feel like they have some protection to come forward. That's why you saw six in the last week FBI whistleblowers come forward with damaging information about Mueller. They've got documents to prove it. And they didn't just go to the media or leak something on an internet site. No. They went directly to members of Congress who had these committees. It was Mr. DeSantis that received 4 of them, Jim Jordan another, and I think may have been Gates that had another one. So there are now FBI officials, because as you can see, as the walls collapse, as the truth begins to emerge, there's a lot of people who are very uncomfortable, and they're now having to make a decision. Do they want to stay silent and become a possible target of prosecution, or do they want to talk and maybe become a witness for the prosecution? This is a decision a lot of people are having to make right now. Next, not so Rosie O'Donnell could be facing a $12 million fine and some jail time for offering to bribe senators to vote against the tax bill. That is a violation of Code 18201, U.S. Code 18-201. The penalty, 15 years in jail, $12 million fine. Basically, you're not allowed to bribe public officials at an election, and she did so multiple times. And then even when she was actually cautioned about it, she just simply doubled down and did it 2 or 3 more times. Now, some people may say, well, she's just some Hollywood idiot, former comedian. They'll just ignore it. But when you go look at the totality of other texts over the past year and a half or so, from Not So Rosie O'Donnell, you can see that there's a very threatening tone in a lot of her tweets. Very threatening tone in those texts. That, as evidence with the fact that she publicly offered a bribe, could put her in some serious legal and criminal liability. Perhaps the Not So Rosie O'Donnell will be sharing a cell with the rotten Reverend Clinton. Maybe Huma too. I will allow your minds and your imagination to work that one out for yourself. I'm pretty sure I know what Mr. Chopra is thinking. The big vote on the FISA Act, Section 702, is coming up. They must get it done by the end of the year, by December 31st. Now, this is something, again, for those of you who've been watching my TowerGate videos all throughout the summer, as you know, I told you I was going to hold certain people accountable. We had Trey the Pitbull, Gowdy. We had Lindsey Graham, Candy Pants Graham. We had Senator Magoo. We had many hardline neocons all saying, yeah, well, if the CIA and the FBI and the NSA, if they don't come clean on all these hearings we're having and start providing the information and the witnesses we've been, requesting, we're not going to vote to reauthorize the FISA Act, this 702, which gives them the right to spy on all of us. Very important tool they say they need. And this was what these guys were saying all during the summer. But now that the vote is getting close, it looks like a lot of them are getting weak in the knees and look like they're going to vote for it. I told you who the frauds were, but there's a few who aren't frauds. One of them is Rand Paul. And Rand Paul is threatening to go to the last resort to stop the FISA Act, Section 702, from being reauthorized by December 31st. Are we looking at another Senator Paul filibuster? Remember the last one he did? I forget how long it lasted, but it's very possible he could do a New Year's Eve, December 31st. Rand Paul could be standing on the Senate floor filibustering the reauthorization of Section 702 of the FISA Act. He's also got Mike Lee and Ron Wyden, along with a few other people, on board. So we know that he's standing tall and looking good. We'll see if the rest of these guys are frauds or if they're for real, because we know that the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, none of them have come clean. None of them have produced what they were supposed to. They're cock-blocking the whole process. We'll see who stands tall and who shrinks in the saddle. Yippee-ki-yay. More on the latest court filing from the Gubarev versus BuzzFeed lawsuit. Remember, the previous Christopher Steele depositions and court filings we've been talking about have originated from the case that was going on in the UK. But there had been quite a legal battle here in the case against BuzzFeed in Florida, where they also wanted to depose Christopher Steele on other types of issues relating to how the dossier was disseminated, and they were getting blocked for a very long time. But as we learned, the attorneys for Gubarev filed the motion, the judge approved the motion, and that's how he got to do the interviews, depositions, interrogations, whatever you want to call them, of Kramer, other individuals, including Christopher Steele. And what we're seeing is that Christopher Steele is doing exactly the same thing in his court filings that we saw him do in the UK. He's staying on the same track, which makes sense. He probably wouldn't want to say something different in Florida than he said in the UK in his court filings and his deposition. So what we're learning is just to confirm what we've already learned, but now we're getting sort of a confirmation of exactly what his positions were. But as we saw in the UK case, we could see that he was trying to distance himself a bit from the dossier's total credibility. Now we can see he's really moving in that direction. Here are the following highlights, and this is brought to you by the New York Post. Pretty good conservative little paper in New York, compared to the New York Times, of course, but some good people over there, and they're obviously the opposite of the New York Times. They're fairly conservative, lean right. But they have a couple good journalists over there, and this is a good story, by the way. I'm not going to read it all, but I'm going to give you the highlights. So what we have learned is that Christopher Steele's deposition shows that Steele has modified his position to the quality of information in the dossier. When he was trying to sell the dossier back in the summer of 2016, he stated matter-of-factly that collusion took place. Now he says it's only possible. Back in 2016, Steele had used the words trusted sources, but now he says limited intelligence. He also says he did not seek out the information, that he only received it. Very important, especially when we focus on, as Mike Whitney did, and we talked about here, when you focus on that last memo. Because if you look at the first 38 memos or 37 memos of the dossier, they're they're really different. That last memo that's dropped on us, Memo 39, which has all the stuff about Mr. Gubarev hacking. It has all the stuff that really makes this a real, like a, almost like goes into like spy novel territory. It goes from something you would see in the National Enquirer, all of a sudden it turns into a spy novel on the last drop. And so we're learning that Christopher Steele says that he did not seek out the information, only received it. He's talking specifically also about this last memo. And he says that that last memo was based on raw intelligence. So this all tells us a great deal. It tells us a great deal, and it raises more and more questions. It almost looks like they got to the finish line. They realized they were not successful in stopping Trump, so they had to so the first part of the dossier took us all the way up to that point. Then all of a sudden Trump's elected, and now all of a sudden the dossier becomes the secret intelligence document which wants to lay out the hacking of the DNC attributed to the Russians who give it to Julian Assange, who are colluding with Trump, and this whole thing gets started. So you can see that someone cooked up this last story, just as Mike Whitney suspected, cooked it up. Probably this did not come from any so-called Russian sources or intermediaries that are Russian or anything like that. It looks a lot more like this part of the dossier, Memo 39, was cooked up at GPS Fusion, possibly at the Department of Justice, the FBI, Andrew McCabe. Some combination of all of this is where this got cooked up. And this is what's being revealed. This is what's going to be unearthed. This is what's going to be learned. And this is what's going to put the vice grips on the testicles of a couple of guys who are quite crooked. Finally, if the demonic Teletubby, Kim Jong-un, tests another nuclear warhead, we are going to take out his facilities and test sites. Sometimes called a bloody nose attack. This will be fast, swift, and deadly. That's a very, very ballsy move. Very, very ballsy move with a lot of question marks. It will be interesting to see if this is true, because you can assume he's going to commit another test. Now, I don't know if the Trump administration has told him that. They've said, look, here it is. Bottom line, if you test another one of those warheads, we're going to hit you hard. That is one hell of a game of chicken right there, my friends. Brass balls. Brass balls. That is what we're dealing with here. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's TowerGate. I'll be back with you for the Saturday evening edition. Incredible breaking news stories that we'll be talking about. And hopefully I can get to that theory from Son of Nuo. You guys have a good night. Be safe. Goodbye.